Ladies and gentlemen, students of truth, seekers of meaning, we live in a world that is increasingly obsessed with immediacy, constant attention, continuous affirmation, instant responses. Silence is seen as coldness, and absence is misread as abandonment. But let me suggest something that may sound paradoxical, even counterintuitive. Ignoring you may not be an act of hate, it could in fact be hidden love. When someone walks away, you think they've abandoned you. But what if their silence is not rejection? It's the storm inside them raging so loudly they cannot even hear themselves anymore. Most people don't leave because they've stopped feeling. They leave because they feel too much and can't control what that does to them. We are quick to label absence as cruelty, but withdrawal is often the only thing someone has left when they're trying not to destroy everything around them. It is easier to fight than it is to leave in silence. But silence is chosen by those who fear the damage their words might cause. Withdrawal is not weakness. It is often the last stronghold of a soul trying to protect what little dignity it has left. People don't retreat because they don't love you. They retreat because they no longer trust themselves not to ruin you. There is a particular kind of love that says, I'm going to step back, because if I stay, I'll cause more pain than good. To remove yourself from someone you deeply care about requires far more discipline than staying and indulging the chaos of unresolved emotion. Sometimes, the person who walks away is the one who was fighting the hardest not to explode. Ignoring is not always an act of indifference. It is sometimes the final expression of care when you don't have the tools to express it well. When your presence starts to carry the risk of destruction, the most loving thing you can do is to walk away before that damage becomes permanent. In the realm of deep emotional connection, silence is not the absence of love, but the evidence of its complexity. There is a deep, unspoken sorrow in the heart of someone who cannot be near you, not because they don't want to, but because they don't know how. Withdrawal is often the voice of love that has grown afraid of its own strength. To distance yourself from someone you love requires a painful kind of awareness, a recognition that your unresolved wounds may bleed onto others. Many people disappear from your life, not out of hatred, but out of an unshakable belief that their presence will do more harm than good. When love becomes unbearable, distance becomes a silent mercy. Silence is not always passive. It's often filled with the loud internal conflict of someone who wants to speak but fears what will come out. To be emotionally overwhelmed is to feel like a ticking bomb. And walking away is the last humane act one can perform before detonation. There is a certain nobility in those who choose absence over dysfunction, who walk away when staying would mean losing themselves or breaking you. You cannot always see the cost of someone's withdrawal, but it often leaves deeper scars on them than it does on you. Avoidance in many cases is not a sign of emotional vacancy, but of emotional saturation, of someone drowning in their own intensity. People who vanish from your life often replay the decision over and over again, not because they're heartless, but because they're tormented by what they had to do. Stepping away is a conscious decision rooted in a recognition of one's current inability to be what the relationship demands. There's a profound grief that lives in those who walk away without a fight, not because they didn't care, but because they cared too much to risk a war. When someone withdraws from you, don't be so quick to assume apathy. Sometimes that distance is the only way they know how to protect you from their chaos. In relationships, the greatest misunderstandings often arise from interpreting retreat as rejection, when it's really a silent, anguished form of protection. You can love someone deeply and still choose to leave when the space between you becomes too dangerous for both of you to survive it. Psychology of withdrawal is the battlefield where love fights its final invisible war. It takes an incredible amount of self-restraint to remain silent when every part of you is screaming to be understood. People do not always disappear because they lack emotion. Often, it's because their emotions are so volatile they fear becoming destructive. Withdrawal is a strategy of self-preservation and at times of preserving the other person's emotional integrity as well. The agony of stepping away from someone you love is a torment that echoes long after the moment has passed. To ignore someone you love is not to erase them. It is to place them in the one place you still have control over: distance. Most people who withdraw carry with them the unbearable weight of what could have been if they had the capacity to stay. Love, when unregulated, turns into something dangerous, and sometimes the only safety lies in separation. People who truly care often choose silence over conflict, not because they are cowards, but because they refuse to turn love into a battlefield. The emotional cost of silence is not zero. It is often a quiet suffering that goes unnoticed by those who only see the surface. In many cases, the one who leaves is the one who has loved the deepest and hurt the hardest. Sometimes, the most compassionate action is to pull away before your own wounds start to poison someone else's healing. It is a painful truth that not all love stories are meant to be lived side by side. Some must be endured from afar. You may never hear the apology you deserve because the person is too ashamed of their inability to be who you needed. The act of ignoring can be a psychological paradox. It feels cold, but is often born from intense emotional heat. Silence is not always neglect. It is sometimes reverence. For you, for what you shared, and for the space needed to preserve it from further damage. Those who withdraw are not running from you. They are retreating from the version of themselves that they fear could harm you. To love and leave at the same time is one of the cruelest psychological tensions a person can experience. Walking away is not always the easy way out. Sometimes it's the hardest decision a heart can make while still loving. What looks like distance is sometimes the truest form of loyalty, a refusal to let your presence become toxic. To be near someone you love, knowing you're emotionally unstable, is a kind of hell. To walk away from them is a quieter one. Sometimes. Ignoring is the last resort of someone who doesn't know how to love healthily, yet can't bear to see you suffer from their flaws. Every time someone ignores you out of love, they are placing your well-being above their own comfort. And that is no small thing. Withdrawal is not the death of love. It is its most disciplined, concealed, and agonizing expression. There comes a moment when love grows so heavy that your chest cannot contain it, and in that moment, stepping away becomes the kindest thing left to do. When emotion reaches its boiling point, it doesn't spill, it scalds, and the person who walks away may be doing so to keep you from being burned. Love is not only a source of comfort, it is also the most volatile force we encounter, and when mismanaged, it suffocates both the giver and the receiver. The closeness that once healed begins to feel like confinement, and distance becomes the only breathable air in a room full of emotional smoke. Sometimes you hold someone so tightly in your heart that the sheer weight of their presence crushes the fragile parts of your soul. What begins as intimacy can mutate into tension when the emotional intensity outweighs the psychological stability to sustain it. To love deeply is to risk fragmentation, and when the pieces start to crack, space isn't betrayal, it's preservation. It's not always that someone doesn't want to stay, it's that staying would mean dying a little more every day, in silence. Some hearts break not from a lack of affection, but from the pressure of loving without the means to handle it. There are times when presence turns into pressure, and the only escape from the collapse is found in stepping back. When connection becomes too overwhelming to manage, absence becomes the last form of devotion that doesn't ask anything in return. A person who disappears while still loving you is not a coward. They are a soul on fire, trying not to ignite you in the process. Intense love without emotional maturity becomes a storm, and stepping away is the only way to keep the flood from drowning both of you. There are affections that come like floods, noble, pure, but destructive. And the levee, sometimes, is the distance one chooses. Loving someone should not feel like surviving them. And when it does, separation becomes a silent act of mercy. You can only carry someone else's emotions for so long before the weight of both your worlds begins to grind you into dust. To walk away from someone who is intertwined in your spirit is to rip your own skin to keep them from bleeding with you. Sometimes the deepest form of empathy is not to stay and suffer together, but to create space so healing can breathe. When the fire of love burns too wildly, it's not a lack of love that drives you away, but the fear of burning down everything you've built. You can scream in silence while sitting beside someone you love, and that scream often sounds like the quiet choice to leave. Being near someone you love while unraveling inside is like holding a rose with thorns too sharp for bare hands. Distance becomes a dressing, not a wound. The more intensely we love, the more dangerous our unresolved damage becomes when proximity keeps triggering pain. When your care becomes a mirror for your own inadequacy, pulling back is the only act that doesn't shatter, both reflective. Yes. Sometimes love stretches so far beyond your capacity that staying would mean suffocating in your own expectations. The human heart has limits, and even the most passionate affection cannot thrive when there's no room left to breathe. Emotional closeness becomes unbearable when the weight of vulnerability turns into fear, and fear never coexists peacefully with love. There are connections so deep they become unbearable when not grounded in stability, and distance becomes a balm for the tremble. It is not hatred that leads someone to walk away from overwhelming love. It is the ache of wanting to do right without knowing how. When your presence begins to echo as pressure in someone else's life. The most compassionate answer is not to stay and be resented, but to leave and be remembered. There is no kindness in staying where you've become a burden, and no cruelty in leaving when your exit is a form of care. The most tragic part of loving someone too deeply is realizing that your intensity may be the very thing that destroys the peace they need. You do not walk away because the connection was false, but because it was too true for the version of you that exists right now. Emotional intimacy is not just about closeness, it is about containment. And when containment fails, retreat becomes a necessity. Sometimes we leave not because we've stopped loving, but because we no longer trust ourselves not to break the other person with our love. To remain near someone while knowing you can't love them in a healthy way is a form of spiritual violence. We walk away when the fire we carry no longer warms but threatens to consume. And in that moment, silence is mercy, not neglect. You cannot pour love from a cracked vessel without watching it leak into the soil. And sometimes walking away is the only way to begin healing the container. Even the strongest hearts have walls. And when love breaches those walls without warning, withdrawal becomes survival. The paradox of love is that it can both save and destroy. And when it leans toward destruction, absence is the lesser devastation. The person who leaves quietly, still loving you, carries a wound that never quite closes. And they carry it so you don't have to. There is nothing noble in staying when your presence becomes the cause of someone else's silent suffering. A soul in turmoil will often isolate itself, not out of apathy, but because it refuses to let its chaos become contagious. Sometimes love is too big for the room, and rather than let it crash the walls, one person steps outside, hoping time might build a bigger space. The pain of letting go while still caring is sharper than any blade, but it is also the clearest proof that the love was real. There are times when the emotional atmosphere becomes so heavy that one must leave just to breathe. And breathing is not betrayal, it is survival. To step away from someone you cannot stop loving is the ultimate act of choosing peace over passion. When passion begins to wound, the heart has limits even when the soul does not. And sometimes the limit is reached while the love still lingers fiercely. When proximity hurts more than absence, the choice becomes clear. Not because it's easy, but because it's necessary. Not all love can be held close. Some of it must be carried in silence, honored through distance, and protected by letting go. Emotional suffocation does not mean the love has died. It means it has become too overwhelming to remain pure within reach. You leave not to escape the love, but to preserve it, to hold it in a space where it won't be corrupted by the strain of proximity. When love becomes unbearable, staying feels like erosion, and walking away, though devastating, becomes the most honest form of care. We live in an age that confuses presence with love and silence with absence, but the human heart is far more complex than what shows on the surface. In a world obsessed with visibility, we've forgotten that the deepest truths are often hidden in the quiet spaces between words. Silence terrifies the modern mind because it cannot be measured, categorized, or affirmed with a notification. We are conditioned to believe that if someone doesn't speak, they don't care. But silence is rarely empty when emotion is involved. People don't always go quiet because they are indifferent. They go quiet because they are overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they feel. In relationships, the loudest cries are sometimes never uttered aloud. They exist in the things left unsaid, in the restraint that love demands. What you interpret as coldness may be someone fighting the war of their own vulnerability, uncertain if their truth will be accepted or weaponized. Silence is not absence. It is the language of those who fear their voice might break what they're trying to protect. There are those who grow quiet, not because they've stopped loving, but because every word they want to say could come out wrong and ruin everything. The need to be heard has become so obsessive that we've lost the ability to hear what is spoken in quiet dignity. Love does not always express itself in presence. It often conceals itself in distance, waiting for a safer time to reveal its truth. The assumption that silence means someone no longer values you is rooted in insecurity, not in truth. We demand answers when we feel discomfort, but rarely do we consider that the silence may be the answer. We're just not ready to understand it. People go silent when they are afraid of being misunderstood and more afraid of what misunderstanding might destroy. To misread silence is to apply your own story to someone else's internal struggle. It is an act of unconscious projection. The absence of words is not always the absence of thought. It may be the pause needed to keep from speaking out of pain. When someone chooses silence over confrontation, it may be because they value peace more than their own pride. We are quick to accuse others of being emotionally unavailable, but rarely do we ask ourselves whether we've made emotional expression safe for them. The one who stays quiet may be carrying the emotional weight of the relationship more than you realize, and doing so silently. To shield you, we interpret silence through the lens of our own fears, but silence is not always about us. It is about the emotional terrain of the other. People often retreat into quiet because their emotions have grown too complex for language, not because they have disappeared. Sometimes the soul is screaming, but the mouth stays shut, hoping that someone will care enough to listen with more than just their ears. It is a dangerous thing to assume that affection only lives in what is said. Many of the most loyal hearts are the quietest ones. We say, if they cared, they would reach out, but perhaps they care so deeply that they fear their presence would cause more harm than good. Silence is often the boundary set by those who have been hurt too often by people who demanded honesty, then punished it. A person may stop talking not because they are distant, but because they are exhausted from trying to say what no one ever truly hears. You cannot measure someone's love by how frequently they speak, but by how consistently they wrestle with what they could say and choose not to. We confuse noise with value, but real love is often felt in the pause, in the restraint, in the moments where nothing is said but everything is meant. The heart that holds back its words is often doing so not from apathy, but from the sacred weight of knowing the wrong word could ruin everything. When people go quiet, it is not always disappearance. It is sometimes a form of spiritual breath, a pause to collect what is breaking inside. We demand performance in our relationships, proof, expression, gesture, but forget that the most honest emotions are the ones too raw to be put into words. Just because someone doesn't say they're hurting doesn't mean they aren't. Some pain is so private that silence becomes its only witness. We misinterpret silence because we listen only for sound, never for depth, never for the tension beneath someone's eyes or the heaviness in their presence. In the space where words should be, there is often a storm of unspeakable things. And just because you cannot hear it doesn't mean it isn't. Roaring. Silence is not the opposite of love. It is its shadow, its waiting room, its sacred preparation for speech too important to rush. There are those who stay quiet not because they are withholding, but because they have too much to say and no trust that it will be handled gently. The fear of being misunderstood is so powerful, it can paralyze even the most affectionate hearts into complete quiet. Sometimes silence is not distance, it is devotion that fears its own clumsiness. A word poorly spoken can break what years of care have built, and some people would rather be silent forever than take that chance. We look at someone's silence and say, they've moved on, but what if they're simply grieving too loudly inside to speak? If love must always shout to be heard, then we've lost the ability to recognize its softer, more sacred forms. The most devastating misinterpretation is to believe that someone's quiet means they stopped feeling, when in truth they've never felt more. We accuse the silent of avoidance, but what if they're enduring more pain than you can imagine, quietly, bravely, relentlessly? There's a kind of love that sits behind silence, watching, hoping, praying, not because it's passive, but because it's patient. To speak is not always strength. Sometimes strength is found in not burdening someone with what you're not sure they're ready to carry. We want closure from people who are still trying to open themselves up without falling apart. You think they left the conversation, but they're still in it, just inside their own mind, in a room you were never invited into. To hear silence and assume abandonment is to forget how many people have loved you too quietly for you to notice. If you measured love by silence, you would miss every parent who suffers in stillness, every friend who listens without reply, every partner who watches you sleep just to make sure you're breathing. There is such a thing as silent loyalty, quiet protection, wordless compassion. And these are often the most enduring forms of love. We have grown so used to constant input that the absence of words feels like the absence of care, but they are not the same. Just because someone is silent doesn't mean they've stopped listening, stopped loving, or stopped fighting for you or with themselves. They may not say a word, but their silence might be the loudest "I love you" they know how to give.